Ruth Ellison stepped down from the afternoon train on a late autumn day in 1887 when the small town tucked inside the valley was still undecided about whether it would become a place worth marking on a map or remain only a temporary stop people forgot the moment they left. There was no welcome. No one hurried forward. Only the old wooden boards of the platform answered with a dull, dry sound beneath her heel, as if the ground itself needed to confirm that it had felt another person arrive. She carried a small bag, the kind used by someone who has learned to compress an entire life into only what is necessary. Inside were a few sets of clothes worn through many seasons, a notebook filled edge to edge with writing, and just enough money to live carefully for a few weeks if she counted every expense. Ruth did not check it again. She knew exactly what she had because for many years now, knowing her limits had become an instinct for survival. Ruth Ellison was 29 years old, formally educated in the East. She had once stood in classrooms with tall windows and clean blackboards, and she had believed that knowledge and discipline were enough to let a woman stand on her own in the world. But those places had closed their doors to her one by one, not because she lacked ability, but because she did not bow at the right moments, did not soften her voice when challenged, and did not know how to make others comfortable when they wanted control. The judgments had come first, wrapped in courtesy, then without it. Too rigid, too difficult to work with, not suitable, and finally, no place left that would take her. This town was the last stop on a list of places with rooms still unfilled. Ruth knew that before she stepped off the train. The people scattered across the platform did not hide their attention. Their eyes passed over her in an orderly way, lingering on her dark skin, on the way she stood straight-backed, on the small bag that said nothing except that she had not come here to rest. It was not curiosity. It was measurement, as if they were deciding what kind of woman she was, what trouble she might bring, and where she should be placed within the town's unspoken order. Ruth did not look away. She was used to being seen that way, even in places that claimed to be far more civilized. She simply stood and waited until a man stepped out from the crowd and stopped in front of her. Thomas Hale was tall in the way of men accustomed to outdoor labor, broad-shouldered, his stance free of wasted motion. He did not offer his hand. Ruth did not expect it. His eyes moved over her quickly, then paused longer than necessary, not on her bag or her clothes, but on her face as if he were trying to read something unspoken. She recognized it almost at once because in that brief moment, Ruth saw something familiar in him as well. Not rudeness, not curiosity. It was the exhaustion of someone who had spent nearly everything he had trying to keep things from falling apart and was still losing ground, bit by bit. "Ruth Ellison," she said, her voice steady, neither raised nor lowered. Thomas nodded. Thomas Hale. There was nothing more. No polite smile. No questions about the journey or whether she needed rest. He turned, motioned for her to follow, and lifted her bag into the wagon with an efficient ease without asking, without testing its weight, as if everything was already understood. The wagon rolled away from the platform, leaving behind the eyes that still watched. The dirt road carried them past a handful of scattered buildings, past a general store with a sun-faded sign, past a small office where matters of paperwork, taxes, and decisions were handled, decisions that those without power could only accept. Ruth sat upright, her hands folded in her lap, watching the town pass, without trying to memorize it. She had learned that in the first days it was better to observe than to reveal. Thomas did not speak. From time to time his gaze flicked toward her, quick and contained. Ruth felt it, but did not turn. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was an unspoken agreement between two people already tired of explaining themselves. When the wagon stopped in front of a small wooden house set apart from the town center, Ruth stepped down with her bag in hand. Her new place of living and work stood there without promise or invitation, present only as a fact that could not be negotiated. Thomas gave a few short instructions about water, about paths, about who might come by. Then he nodded, turned the wagon, and drove away without looking back. Ruth stood alone as the late-day wind moved across the open ground before her. There would be no more trains, no more lists to try. She set her bag down, looked at the door ahead, and understood clearly that this was not a place she had chosen for hope, but what remained after every other road had closed. And because of that, she stepped forward, opened the door, and went inside, carrying everything she had left. Ruth Ellison began her first working day before the sun had fully cleared the low hills east of town. Thin, pale light slipped through the scratched window panes, revealing a long, narrow wooden room in complete quiet. This was the town's school, though the word felt generous. It was a single room, a few worn desks, a blackboard cracked near the lower corner, and a teacher's table that had belonged to many before her, none of them staying long enough to leave a mark. Ruth opened the door, hung her coat, set her small bag beside the table, and stood still for a moment, taking in the space that would now carry her name. The smell of old wood chalk dust and leftover damp from the night blended into something familiar to anyone who had stayed in this work long enough to understand that it was not a respected calling, but a duty the town maintained at the lowest acceptable level. She began with tasks no one had assigned, but which were always necessary. She wiped the board clean. She rearranged the desks to make room for children of different ages. She checked the books on the shelf, their spines softened by use, and made notes of what could still serve and what no longer did. No one came by while she worked. No morning greeting. No questions about whether she needed anything. The silence did not unsettle Ruth. It only confirmed what she already knew before arriving. She existed here because a position had been empty, not because anyone had expectations of her. By mid-morning, a few adults from the town began to appear, most of them women, mothers, or grandmothers of the children, who would soon fill the room. They stood at the doorway or stepped inside only a pace or two, looking around with an expression that mixed caution with judgment, as if deciding whether this woman would bring order or trouble. Ruth greeted them in a steady voice, neither warm nor cold, careful enough to leave no opening for speculation. The questions came indirectly. They asked about school hours, about discipline, about whether she was strict, about how she handled disobedient children. Few asked about teaching methods or learning itself. Ruth answered clearly, briefly, staying within what was necessary. She did not boast, and she did not diminish herself. She noticed the distance in the way they listened, especially when their eyes paused on her dark skin before moving on as if it were a detail not meant to be stared at, but impossible to ignore. The men appeared less often. When they did, they leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, their looks openly doubtful. A few made remarks, half joking, half testing, about a woman enforcing discipline over their children, especially a woman from elsewhere. Ruth heard them, registered them, and did not respond. She understood well enough that in places like this, reaction only made things worse. Thomas Hale came in the afternoon, when Ruth was trying to adjust a cabinet door sagging on its hinges. He brought a toolbox, a few boards, and the dust of the road still clinging to his clothes. He did not announce himself or ask questions. He nodded once and began checking what needed repair, as if maintaining the school were simply another link in the chain of responsibility he carried for the town. Ruth did not ask him to help with the cabinet door. She applied steady pressure, adjusted the hinge with an old screw patient to the point of stubbornness. While she worked, Thomas looked up at her, his gaze lingering longer than usual, not out of curiosity but recognition. Someone accustomed to managing on her own, not because she lacked need, but because help so often arrived with a cost attached. He said nothing. When he saw she needed it, he set a nail on the table instead of handing it to her, a small, deliberate gesture. When the work was done, he packed his tools, nodded again, and left, returning the room to its quiet. The following days moved in the same rhythm. Ruth arrived early and left when the light began to fade. She worked, kept notes, prepared lessons for children who had not yet appeared but already existed in her mind as a coming responsibility. She did not seek friendliness, nor did she avoid it. She stood where she belonged in a space where the town had not yet decided whether she deserved to stay. In that quiet, people began to grow used to Ruth Ellison as part of the school, unremarkable, not fully welcomed, yet impossible to ignore. And in this period, before children's voices filled the room, before conflict rose to the surface, the viewer begins to attach to her because the feeling is familiar, standing at the edge, doing one's work well, while the world weighs whether it will allow you to remain. Ruth Ellison did not come to understand Thomas Hale's situation through a confession, but through small details scattered, repeated often enough that they could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. From the classroom window, when the afternoon light slanted down into the valley and sharpened the outlines of the surrounding land, she could see fields stretching outward, thinner than one would expect of a ranch still meant to be standing strong. There was livestock, but not much, and not held in dense herds. They stood apart, quiet, like what remained after a long season of cutting back that no one wanted to speak about. Thomas began appearing more regularly in the weeks that followed, partly because the old schoolhouse demanded constant minor repairs, and partly because his ranch lay close enough that stopping by required no explanation. He carried tools worn smooth by use, metal scratched, and dulled wooden handles darkened by sweat and years. Nothing was new. There were no signs of replacement or investment. Ruth noticed this not with curiosity, but with the eye of someone long accustomed to systems where delay is the first visible mark of collapse. One afternoon, as Thomas worked on the back porch roof of the school, Ruth brought him a bucket of water. Not out of courtesy, but because the day had turned hotter than expected, and the task left little room for rest. He took it, nodded, drank once, and set it down without thanks, without the need for it. They stood side by side for a few minutes, looking out over the open land behind the school, where his ranch lay apart, clear to see, yet not close. "You have fewer cattle than I thought," Ruth said, her voice even without judgment. Thomas did not turn right away. He tightened a bolt as if he needed a few seconds to decide whether the answer was worth giving. "Some seasons require selling," he said at last. "Not every season lets you keep everything." Ruth nodded. She did not ask why. She already knew the answer would not differ from what she had seen elsewhere, places where weather markets and paperwork turn against a person all at once. A silence followed long enough for both of them to understand that this conversation was not meant to comfort. "The bank holds the papers," Thomas went on, as though he had decided to say what mattered. "They've given me time, but time isn't free." Ruth turned to look at him. There was no surprise in her face, no pity, only the full attention of someone who understood exactly what those simple words meant. The bank holding the papers meant every decision was delayed. It meant every working day carried a long shadow of uncertainty. It meant the ground beneath his feet no longer fully belonged to him. "How long?" she asked. "One more season," Thomas said. "Maybe two if the weather holds and nothing goes wrong." There were no promises, no plans laid out, only bare timelines spoken the way one recites figures at the end of a long day. Ruth listened without filling the space with advice he had not asked for. She had been on the other side of such conversations, where people rushed to offer solutions more to soothe themselves than to truly help. "You keep fixing things," she said, gesturing toward the roof, "even as everything is shrinking." Thomas followed her gaze. "If I don't keep what's here standing," he said slowly, "it will fall apart before I can do anything else." Ruth understood. Some people maintain what they have not out of hope, but because letting go hurts more. She looked at him more carefully now, not with assessment, but recognition. His shoulders sloped slightly, not from age, but from accumulated weight. His hands were rough not only from labor, but from years that did not allow real rest. Their eyes met longer than usual, without avoidance, without the search for false agreement. In that moment, there was no distance between the man repairing a porch and the woman standing in a classroom between rancher and teacher. There were only two people standing on different edges of the same problem: how to continue when familiar ground is slowly giving way. Thomas turned back to his work. Ruth stood a moment longer, then went inside. But from that day on, whenever she looked toward the ranch, she no longer saw a distant piece of land, but a quiet struggle unfolding. And Thomas, when he came by the schoolhouse, was no longer just a man carrying tools. He was a man holding on to every inch of ground beneath him, not out of pride, but because he was not yet ready to let go. The school officially opened in early October, when the mornings had turned cold enough for breath to show faintly in the air, and the children arrived with unfamiliar steps, carrying the smell of damp earth, wet wool, and the caution learned from adults. Ruth Ellison stood at the doorway and watched them enter one by one, different ages, different shapes, and she recognized immediately what anyone who has done this work learns quickly: the order of the outside world follows children into the room without needing an invitation. The first days passed in a relatively steady rhythm. Ruth observed more than she intervened, taking note of the sidelong looks, the quick glances, the sudden silences when she turned her back. Some children were used to speaking loudly, taking space-testing limits. Others had learned to fold inward, to sit at the edges to avoid notice. Ruth saw the hierarchy clearly, not as a problem to be corrected at once, but as a reality that had to be understood before it could be touched. The incident came on a weekday noon when the sun stood high, but not warm enough to drive the cold from the shaded ground. The children poured into the dirt yard behind the school to eat their lunches, breaking into small groups by long-established habit. Ruth stood at the window eating the simple bread she had brought, watching not to supervise in the narrow sense, but to son for the small shifts that usually signal something about to cross a line. She noticed one child standing apart, smaller, quieter lunch, still untouched in hand. Nearby, a group of older children said something Ruth could not hear, then laughed. A rough movement followed, just enough to knock the food onto the ground. Laughter came again, this time unhidden. Other children saw it, then looked away quickly and with practiced ease, as if they already understood that not seeing was a form of safety. Ruth did not hesitate. She set her bread down, opened the door, and stepped into the yard. Her voice was not raised, not sharp, but it was clear enough to cut through the noise beginning to gather. She called the name of the child responsible. No questions, no request for explanation. Just the name and a motion for the child to come forward. The silence spread faster than she expected. The children froze, curious and uneasy, accustomed to adults who either ignored such moments or handled them with vague warnings that changed nothing. Ruth did neither. She pointed to the spilled food, then looked directly at the child in front of her. Her expression held no anger, but it offered no leniency. "Pick it up," she said, "and apologize." The child hesitated and glanced toward the road leading past the schoolyard, knowing his father often passed by at this hour. Ruth saw the glance. She understood exactly what it meant, but she did not move. She stood still and waited, not repeating herself, as if time itself were on her side. At last, the child bent down, gathered the food, and muttered an apology that barely held together. Ruth nodded, sent him back to his place, then turned to the child who had been targeted and told him to come inside, where she would find a way to replace the lost lunch. She did all of it quietly, no lecture, no speech, no need for an audience. But an audience already existed. A man stood at the edge of the yard where the shadow of an outbuilding stretched long. The punished child's father. He had seen everything. He stepped forward, his voice low and heavy with undisguised anger, demanding to know who she thought she was, to shame his son in front of everyone. Ruth turned to face him. She did not apologize. She did not soften her tone. She stated plainly within the boundaries of the responsibility given to her that her role was to protect order and safety for every student without exception. That if he wished to challenge it, he could bring the matter to the town council, but within this school, she was the one accountable. Those words, spoken calmly, landed like a challenge. The man flushed and delivered a few warnings about how she was still new, how she did not yet understand how things worked here. Ruth listened, then turned away, ending the exchange without adding another word. By afternoon, the talk had begun to spread. In the general store along the dirt road, in brief pauses between daily tasks, people spoke of the new school teacher, the woman who did not know her place, who had embarrassed a family with standing in the town. Ruth caught fragments as she passed and knew there would be more. She did not stop to explain. She did not defend herself. Thomas Hale saw her from a distance late that day as he passed the schoolyard on his way back to the ranch. He did not approach. He did not ask questions. But his gaze lingered on her figure standing alone at the school door longer than usual, and in that look there was a clear shift. Not surprise. Not concern. Recognition of something that could not be undone. As Ruth locked the schoolhouse and walked away in the fading afternoon light, she understood exactly what she had done. She had stood with the weaker one, and by doing so had pushed herself farther from the town's few safe circles. Neutral ground was gone. Quiet invisibility was no longer possible. She walked on, with her back straight, knowing that from now on, every step would be watched more closely, and that the isolation beginning around her was not an accident, but the cost of a deliberate choice. Ruth Ellison knew Thomas Hale was about to lose his ranch before he ever said it out loud, in the way one senses a storm coming while the sky is still clear. The signs were scattered everywhere, not loud, but consistent enough to ignore fewer cattle on the hillsides. Thomas arriving at the school later than he used to. His face darkened more by exhaustion than by sun or wind, and the papers he carried in his coat pocket folded with care but worn soft at the edges, as if they had been opened too many times without bringing anything new. One evening in early November, when the wind carried a sharper cold and the light faded quickly enough to force decisions sooner than planned, Thomas stopped by the school to fix a loose window frame. Ruth stayed late that night, grading papers, rows of numbers, and uneven handwriting, filling the pages before her, while her thoughts drifted toward matters that did not belong to the classroom. When he finished, they stood together on the narrow porch, the yellow lamplight spilling out just enough to show their faces at close range. The bank sent a letter, Thomas said, as if reporting the weather. His voice steady but low. They want to see me next week. Ruth nodded. She did not ask what it said. She had heard enough stories like this in other towns with other people where paper always had the final word. How long, she asked, repeating the old question, not because she lacked the answer, but because she wanted to hear it from him. Through winter, he said, if I can't raise the money before the snow breaks. There was no exaggeration, no drama, just a clear deadline as cold as the season closing in on them. Ruth looked at him without looking away, and in that moment, she saw how deeply the fatigue had settled into his movements. Not the tiredness of a long day, but the exhaustion of years spent holding on to something already slipping free. They stood in silence for a while. Wind crossed the open ground behind the school, carrying the smell of dry grass and cold earth. Ruth drew a slow breath, as if granting herself a final moment to check a decision that had taken shape long ago, weighed carefully until there was no room left for sentiment. I have money, she said at last, her voice calm, unhurried. Not much, but enough to buy time. Thomas turned to her, surprise unhidden this time. No, he said at once, quicker than necessary. I won't take it. Ruth did not react. She had expected the answer just as she had expected the reason behind it. "I'm not talking about giving it," she went on evenly. "I'm talking about an investment, a clear agreement, proper papers. I put in money. I take a share." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "You don't know what you're saying." "On the contrary," Ruth said, stepping half a pace closer, close enough that he had to look directly at her. "I know exactly what I'm saying. I know the value of land, of cattle, of time. And I know how banks operate once they're holding the deeds." The space between them tightened not with intimacy, but with strain. Thomas's eyes darkened, not with anger, but with something deeper, something tied to pride. "I won't let a woman carry my risk for me," he said. "Especially you." Ruth caught the weight on the last two words. Not contempt, but fear. Fear of being seen as dependent. Fear of losing the last piece of ground that was still his, even if only in meaning. She did not argue at once. She let his words settle, then answered slowly, clearly. "I'm not carrying your risk," she said. "I'm choosing it. The same way you choose to hold this ranch together one more day knowing what it costs." Thomas looked at her as if searching for a gap he could escape through. "People will talk," he said. "They'll say you're buying me. Buying this ranch. Buying my honor." "They already talk," Ruth replied without hesitation. "They talked the day I stepped off the train. They talked when I stood up for that child. They'll talk no matter what I do." Silence stretched between them. They stood close enough for Ruth to feel his breath in the cold air, close enough for Thomas to see the unshakable resolve in her eyes. Still, neither reached for the other. Not from lack of desire, but because both understood this was not a moment for confusion. "I don't need your answer tonight," Ruth said. "I just need you to understand this isn't pity. It's a deal. If the ranch survives, I gain. If it fails, I lose my money. That's all." Thomas turned away, looking into the darkness where his ranch lay, as if studying a map with only two exits, neither of them easy. When he faced her again, his gaze was still hard, but his voice had slowed. "You'll regret this." Ruth met his eyes now with a strange calm, as if she had finally reached the far end of every hesitation. "I've regretted enough," she said. "I don't have anything left to lose." The words hung between them, plain, unadorned, heavy enough that Thomas found no answer. Ruth went inside, took her coat, and prepared to leave. As she stepped down into the cold wind, she knew clearly that the decision she had just spoken would be called foolish, and that it would shape everything that came after. Still, she walked on with her back straight, carrying the certainty of someone who had counted every cost and chosen to pay it anyway. That night began at the schoolhouse, not at the ranch, and it did not begin with an emotional decision. Ruth Ellison stayed later than usual to finish her notes, while the wind shifted suddenly enough to rattle the window panes, and the sky seemed to lower, as if narrowing the space between earth and cloud. The rain came after, not all at once, but heavy and persistent, falling in long stretches, until the dirt road in front of the school turned into a slick ribbon of mud no longer fit for travel. Thomas Hale arrived after full dark, his coat soaked through the smell of rain clinging to the cloth. He came because the back porch roof had started to leak, nothing dramatic, but enough to let water in if left overnight. Ruth stood in the doorway and watched him work under the weak light, saying nothing. They were used to meetings like this, quiet repairs that required no explanation, work no one else would take on. When he finished, the rain had not let up and the wind had grown stronger. Thomas stood still for a moment, looking out into the dark where the road toward town had lost its edges. "You shouldn't go now," he said. It was not advice, but a conclusion. Ruth stepped onto the porch, followed his gaze, and judged it for herself. She knew the difference between caution and needless risk. Thomas's ranch lay closer than town. The path there was muddy, but shorter with places sheltered from the wind. There was no other reasonable choice. Ruth nodded, no hesitation, no need for further explanation. The decision was made the way many of theirs had been made before, on facts, not on want. They reached the ranch after the rain had eased, though the cold had not. The house stood lit in the darkness like a temporary anchor, no promise, no invitation. Thomas rebuilt the fire and set a kettle on the stove, the familiar movements of a man long accustomed to living alone. Ruth sat near the hearth, pulled off her gloves, and felt the warmth return to her hands, while the rain outside kept its steady rhythm. Neither spoke at first. The silence here was different from the silence at the school, not tense, not guarded, but wide enough to hold things that had never been said. Thomas spoke first. He talked about the early years of the ranch, about the simple belief that if you worked hard enough, the land would answer in kind. He spoke of long droughts of signing papers at the bank, where each signature seemed to take another piece of control away. Ruth listened without interruption, without trying to soften what he said. When it was her turn, Ruth spoke of the places she had passed through, of positions that once seemed secure and then vanished, of how polite words were often used to disguise exclusion. She spoke of learning not to expect too much of the exhaustion that comes from always having to prove you deserve to stay. Her voice held no bitterness, but every sentence carried the weight of years lived long enough to lose illusions. There were pauses between their stories that did not need filling. The fire cracked softly. The wind outside weakened. Thomas rose to add wood, and as he bent, his hand brushed Ruth's wrist when she passed him a log. The touch was light, hesitant enough to stop them both. Neither pulled away at once. Neither moved closer. The moment stretched not from uncertainty, but from clear awareness of what was happening. Ruth looked up at him. There was no question, no invitation, only the full presence of someone who had thought long enough to know this was not impulse. Thomas met her gaze slowly, as if placing this choice alongside the most serious decisions he had ever made. When they touched again, it was not the rush of people afraid of losing a chance, but the deliberate choice of two people who understood the cost of no longer looking away. The night passed in a closeness that required no vows, where each movement carried respect, and each silence was filled with an understanding already formed, needing no name. Morning came slowly. Pale light entered through the window, revealing the plain room and the signs of a night that could not be undone. Ruth woke first and sat quietly for a time, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch as the day began. Thomas woke after. He said nothing, only looked at her, his eyes steady, neither avoiding nor seeking reassurance. There were no promises, no plans laid out that morning. When the rain eased and the road dried enough to travel, Ruth prepared to return to the school. Thomas walked her to the door, the gesture familiar, but carrying a new weight. They stood close for a moment, then stepped apart, each returning to their work. No clinging, no attempt to lessen what had happened. Both understood that nothing had been spoken yet, everything had changed. There was no returning to indifference, and no need to rush to name what now stood between them. That night had solved nothing, but it placed a clear truth where neither could ignore it. From this point on, the choices ahead would no longer be made in isolation, even if the road forward remained far from easy. Rumors did not need time to form. They only needed a wide enough space between what had happened and what had not been spoken aloud, and this town had never lacked such spaces. Within days of the rainy night, Ruth Ellison felt the air around her change, not suddenly or loudly, but by degrees, the way cold settles into the bones before one realizes the season has turned. The looks that had once been cautious grew sharper. In the general store, conversations broke off when Ruth entered, then resumed behind her in lowered voices, careful enough to avoid open rudeness. Polite nods disappeared. Invisible distances widened, making each of her steps sound louder on the old wooden floors. Ruth did not need to hear the words themselves to understand she had been placed somewhere new, lower, less comfortable, where every action could be read in the worst possible light. At the school, the shift was clearer still. Some parents no longer met her eyes when they dropped off their children. Others lingered at the doorway longer than necessary, as if searching for a reason to speak, then thought better of it. Complaints began to surface, not directly, but through the town council, through questions about teaching methods, about inappropriate influence, about whether a woman living alone should stand before children at all. Ruth read the notes, their language polite but edged with suspicion, and she understood that these were not new concerns, only ones that now had an excuse to be voiced. Thomas Hale felt the change as well, though differently. At the ranch, familiar faces came by less often. A few deals were delayed without explanation. In town, handshakes that had once been firm turned loose, and other men's eyes lingered on him longer than before, not with respect, but with appraisal. Some offered remarks, half joking, half pointed, about letting a woman get too involved in matters meant to remain private. Thomas did not respond. He was used to judgment for what he no longer controlled, but this time the doubt cut at what he valued most, his sense of honor. They avoided each other in public, not by agreement, but because both understood that any closeness, even accidental, would serve as proof for stories already written. When Thomas came to the school, he spoke only what was necessary, his gaze never lingering. Ruth answered with a cool professionalism, keeping just enough distance to prevent misunderstanding. And yet each time their eyes met by chance in those brief moments, both felt the same undeniable pull, as if something remained between them despite every effort to deny it. In the evenings, when each returned to separate rooms, the strain grew clearer. Ruth sat alone in her small quarters, listening to wind slip through cracks she had not yet repaired, and wondered whether she had gone too far. She had lived long enough to know that some choices could not be explained or defended, only endured. She considered stepping back, widening the distance, making herself easier for the town to accept. But each time the thought formed, she recognized that she no longer had the ability to pretend the rainy night had not happened, that the understanding she had found could simply be set aside. Thomas did not sleep easily either. He worked longer hours as if labor could drive away unwelcome thoughts. Yet in the rare pauses, Ruth's image returned not as temptation, but as a truth he had never allowed himself to face, that someone saw him not merely as a failing rancher, but as a man trying to hold on to something that mattered. He thought of speaking to her, of drawing lines of ending, whatever might invite further trouble. The idea never lasted. He knew he could not return to the earlier state where everything was kept at a safe distance and felt empty for it. The town went on as it always did, with meetings, small exchanges, quiet judgments never put to paper. Ruth and Thomas continued in their roles, each holding the ground they had chosen, though the cost became clearer by the day. Neither spoke of it, but both understood they were standing at a crossing, with no easy way back. As winter approached, the cold sharpened everything. Ruth walked the dirt road to the school, with the familiar weight of isolation, but now it carried a different depth. She was no longer simply the one set aside for being different. She was the one who had chosen, and was living with the consequence of that choice. From a distance, Thomas watched the schoolhouse light at night, and knew that no matter how carefully they kept apart, the invisible tie between them had already been drawn tight, not by promise, but by an unalterable truth. They both wanted to step back. Each had considered it more than once, but in the quiet days that followed, what became clearest was not fear of other people's eyes, but the understanding that returning to what had been was no longer a real option. What had been seen and acknowledged could not be erased by silence, and the price of that choice, however heavy, was one they were both, without saying, so willing to pay. The alliance between Ruth Ellison and Thomas Hale did not begin with a declaration, nor was it marked by any spoken decision. It took shape the way lasting things often do, quietly, out of necessity, and beyond reversal. After the rumors settled over the town like a fine dust, no one bothered to sweep away. Both of them understood that if they meant to remain standing, they could no longer move like parallel lines that crossed only by chance and silence. Ruth began going out to the ranch in the late afternoons after the school had emptied, and the light had softened enough not to draw attention. She did not arrive as a guest, and not as a lover, but as someone accustomed to entering failing systems and setting them back into motion. Thomas laid out old ledgers, numbers penciled in haste, debts carried more in memory than on paper. Ruth opened the books and began to read slowly, carefully, as if listening to a story told in figures. She did not fault him for the disorder. She restored order. Income and expense were rewritten cleanly. Deadlines were marked. Costs that could be cut were circled with a firm, unyielding line. Thomas sat across from her and watched the work without interrupting, committing each point to memory. He did not feel invaded. For the first time in years, he felt he was no longer carrying everything alone. Thomas worked harder. Not because anyone asked him to, but because now each hour had a clear purpose. He rose earlier, returned later, checked every fence, every remaining head of cattle, as if they were the final links keeping the whole structure from collapse. Ruth did not stop him. She made sure his effort was not wasted by poor calculation. When he sold part of the herd, she helped him determine how much was enough to cover interest, without destroying recovery. When he considered buying feed, she helped him choose the timing and the price he could afford. Their contact came naturally through the work. When Thomas handed Ruth a stack of papers, their fingers touched briefly, not enough to call intimate, but enough to pause them both for a beat. When Ruth stood to reach a high shelf, Thomas set a hand on the back of the chair to steady her, a small gesture, unremarked yet attentive. The looks they exchanged required no explanation. Both were practiced at reading what was not said. The ranch began to show signs of recovery so slight, they might have gone unnoticed at a glance. A few new cattle appeared on the hillside, not many, but enough to break the long sense of emptiness. Letters from the bank grew less frequent, their tone less sharp, as if the system itself recognized the place still had footing. Thomas felt the change first in himself, in the way his steps grew lighter on ground that had felt heavy for months. Ruth saw hope differently, not in head counts or correspondence, but in the rhythm of the ranch. Meals were prepared with care again, no longer purely provisional. Evenings were not just silent exhaustion, but brief exchanges about tomorrow, what needed doing, what risks could be taken. She understood then that she was not merely helping a ranch survive. She was participating in the rebuilding of a life. They kept their distance in public. In town, Ruth and Thomas rarely stood close and never talked longer than necessary. But at the ranch, where the work demanded cooperation, caution gave way to trust. There was no need to revisit the rainy night. No need to confirm anything. What they were doing together said enough. There were afternoons when the sun fell low and light stretched across the still thin fields, and Ruth and Thomas stood side by side without speaking. In those moments, their partnership required no explanation and no outside approval. It existed as a simple fact they had chosen the same side not from blind feeling, but because both understood that only this way could they keep what was still worth keeping. Hope did not arrive as a grand promise. It came as a deeper breath, a steadier step on ground that had once given way. Ruth saw that the decision once called foolish was revealing its own logic, not obvious to everyone. Thomas saw that letting another person into his world did not weaken him. It gave him more reason to stand. And in that quiet cooperation, both began to believe that what they were building, fragile as it was, remained real enough to go on. There comes a point when pretending stops working, not because patience runs out, but because the truth grows too clear to keep stepping around it. For Ruth Ellison and Thomas Hale. That point arrived one late winter afternoon, when pale light stretched across ground, no longer drowned in mud, and the ranch held a fragile calm strong enough to let them look directly at things they had once only allowed themselves to think about in passing. They no longer avoided one another when they were alone. Workdays ran longer. Late meals were no longer arranged to end quickly. The careful indifference they had maintained dissolved not in a sudden break, but through small accumulations that lasted too long to be accidental. Eyes lingered beyond necessity. Silence no longer served as defense, but as a space waiting for something to be spoken. The conversation came one evening after the day's work was finished. Ruth was recording the final figures in the ledger, while Thomas stood near the window looking out at the darkness spreading over the hills. There was no dramatic air, no sense that something momentous was about to be declared. Only a stillness quiet enough that the truth was no longer buried beneath fatigue. "We can't go on like this," Ruth said without turning around, her voice calm to the point of cool. Thomas did not answer right away. He knew exactly what like this meant. It meant the accidental touches that were no longer accidental. It meant relying on each other beyond what could be called simple cooperation. It meant that each time one of them left, the absence registered more sharply than before. "I'm not looking for promises," Ruth went on, setting down her pen and turning to face him. "Not talk of forever, or plans that don't exist yet. I only need to know one thing." Thomas met her gaze without looking away. "What is it? Are you staying?" The question came plain and direct without ornament. Not a plea, not a challenge. Just a practical question like the ones they were used to asking while working side by side. The pause stretched. Thomas did not answer immediately, not because he didn't know, but because he understood the weight of what she was asking. Staying was not only about the ranch, not only about debts or land. Staying meant no longer retreating from what had already been seen. It meant accepting that someone else was now waiting on his decisions, not to be rescued, but to walk alongside him. "I've always stayed," he said, at last, his voice low and steady. "I just didn't think it mattered to anyone else before." Ruth did not smile. She was not there for reassurance. "I need action," she said. "Not because I doubt you, but because I've lived too long on promises that had no ground under them." Thomas nodded. He did not argue. He did not explain. He had always measured himself by what he did rather than what he said, and this was no different. The next morning, he began with things that could not be mistaken. He postponed an unnecessary trip into town to stay and repair the north fence where winter winds had loosened the posts. He turned down a temporary job elsewhere, even though the pay was tempting, because it would have taken him away from the ranch for weeks. He began showing up more consistently on the evenings Ruth stayed late, making sure she did not have to manage alone when the work required two people. Ruth noticed the change not through grand gestures, but through consistency. Through Thomas being there when needed without being asked. Through the way he arranged his work so he would not disappear at critical moments. Through the way he asked her opinion before making decisions that affected them both, not out of courtesy, but because it felt natural to do so. They did not speak again at length about what had been asked. They did not repeat the answer. But the avoidance that had once shaped their movements was gone. When their eyes met, there was no longer caution. When their hands brushed during work, neither pulled away. Those gestures did not need to be made official with words. They had already become part of the new reality. In town, they still kept their restraint. Yet even there, Thomas no longer stepped back when standing near Ruth. He did not make a display of it, nor did he issue a challenge. He simply stood where he stood without apology. Ruth saw that this shift, small as it was, unsettled the looks around them, not because they were openly declaring anything, but because they were no longer hiding. Feeling did not deepen through vows or dramatic acts, but through clarity. Ruth no longer had to wonder whether she was stepping into another empty space. Thomas no longer pretended that what he was building was only a ranch. They stood in the same place facing forward, no longer avoiding the question that had already been asked. Staying in their terms was not a promise to some distant future. It was a series of choices repeated daily, steady enough to become truth. And within that truth, both understood that feeling, once it stopped hiding, did not need to be named loudly in order to keep growing. The proposal did not arrive on a special evening, nor was it prepared as a moment meant to be remembered. It came early in the morning, while mist still lay low across the ground in front of the ranch, and the day's work had already begun long before the sun had risen high. Ruth Ellison stood at the kitchen table reviewing the final figures in the ledger. Thomas Hale wiped his hands after repairing a section of fence that had collapsed overnight. There was no romance in the air, only the familiarity of two people who had worked through enough together to no longer require a chosen setting. Thomas spoke while Ruth was still looking down at the page, as if the thought had been held long enough and now simply needed to be set down. "We could make this easier," he said, his voice low, steady, not testing her reaction. More lawful, more straightforward. Ruth looked up, not rushing to answer. She was used to the way he spoke of important things without trying to soften them. "What are you talking about?" she asked, though she already suspected. "Marriage," Thomas said. "No circling, no kneeling, no ring, no promise wrapped in feeling. Just the word placed where it belonged, carrying all its practical consequences." They stood facing each other, the small kitchen quiet enough for the wind slipping through the doorframe to be heard. Ruth studied him, her expression neither surprised nor softened. "For convenience," she asked. "Because the town would accept us more easily." Thomas shook his head. "Not only for that. But I won't deny it would make things clearer. For us. For the ranch. For the decisions we've made and will keep making." Ruth set the pen down and closed the ledger as if she needed to step away from the work to address this honestly. "I don't need to be legalized to stay," she said. "And I don't need protection through a title." "I know," Thomas replied. "If I thought you needed saving, I wouldn't be asking." That stopped her longer than anything else he had said. She looked at him more carefully, not for emotion, but for consistency. "Then I need to be clear about my terms," she said, her voice calm, unyielding. "If we marry, I don't disappear into it. I don't give up my work. I don't step aside from decisions that shape our shared life. I don't become decoration for this ranch or for your standing." Thomas did not answer at once. He leaned against the table, both hands resting on the wood, darkened by years, weighing not whether to agree, but the weight of what she had just said. "I don't want someone behind me," he said finally. "I want someone beside me. If that isn't what you mean, then we shouldn't do this." Ruth nodded without smiling. "And I won't marry to be chosen," she added. "I will only marry if I am not required to make myself smaller." Thomas stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough that his words would not drift. "I don't want you smaller," he said. "I want you at your full measure. I've seen how you work. I have no intention of taking that from you." There was no emotional crest, no breath-held moment. Only clarity placed on the table piece by piece, like terms in an agreement both understood would shape what remained of their lives. Ruth looked at him once more, not to find certainty in him, but to confirm it in herself. "If we do this," she said, "it doesn't replace what we've built. It only puts a legal frame around it." "That's right," Thomas said. The silence that followed was not tense but necessary. Ruth took a slow breath, then nodded lightly, not in concession, but in confirmation. "Then yes," she said, "but we do it our way." Thomas did not smile broadly. He only nodded as if concluding a serious agreement. "Our way," he repeated. They did not embrace. They did not kiss. There was no need to mark the moment with gesture. Outside, the sun climbed higher, the mist lifting from the ground to reveal the tracked earth of a place still being used, still alive. Ruth reopened the ledger and added a few lines to the plan for the coming week. Thomas took his coat and stepped outside to continue the work left unfinished. The proposal had been spoken, the terms set, and the agreement reached not through swelling feeling, but through rare respect. Both understood that the decision promised no easy road, but it allowed them to keep moving forward without bending themselves to fit the expectations of others. And in its lack of ornament, there was a weight solid enough to stand. Life did not change immediately after the proposal, and it did not need to in order to prove anything. It continued in the familiar rhythm of the ranch and the school, only now Ruth Ellison and Thomas Hale no longer lived those two halves apart. They shared a home not as a declaration, but as the natural result of choices already made and terms already set. Mornings began early. Thomas went out while the dew still clung to the ground, checking the cattle, straightening fence posts loosened by the night wind. Ruth sat at the kitchen table reviewing ledgers, marking due payments and priority costs, then left when the school required her presence. Neither waited for the other to start the day. They simply knew that when the day ended, both would return to the same place with work completed and work still to be discussed. The ranch steadied itself without spectacle. There were no leaps that invited admiration. Only small, durable gains built on discipline and consistency. The herd grew slowly but steadily. Debts were paid more reliably. Letters from the bank lost their threatening tone and shifted toward negotiation. Thomas worked no less than before, but now his effort was no longer a guess. Ruth made certain each hour of labor fit into a structure that could hold. Ruth did not disappear from her own work. She continued to go to the school each day, holding her role not for title, but for responsibility. Parents who had once been wary began to look at her differently, not because she lived with Thomas, but because their children improved, because the classroom held order, because problems were handled with steady fairness. Ruth did not try to make herself likable. She did her work well. In time, that was enough to earn a respect that did not need to be requested. At the ranch, Ruth did not stand aside. She took part in decisions large and small, from selling livestock when prices rose to delaying purchases when the timing was wrong. Thomas did not treat her input as interference. He saw it as part of the system that had carried him through the hardest season. Their exchanges were not always smooth, but they were honest. They argued with facts and experience, not with authority. The town adjusted its view in its own way slowly, and without admitting it had ever been wrong. Whispers thinned out. Appraising stares became brief nods on the road. Some began asking Ruth about bookkeeping and household management quietly, but clearly enough to show they recognized her competence was no accident. Thomas was no longer seen as a man on the edge of losing everything, but as one who had held on to his ranch through persistence and timely decisions. Ruth found that this shift did not bring relief in the way people might expect. It only confirmed what she had long understood: real respect does not come from being accepted, but from not being dismissed. She did not need the town's affection. She needed only that her work could no longer be ignored. In the evenings, when the day settled, Ruth and Thomas sat together, sometimes at the kitchen table, sometimes on the porch, watching the light fade over land that had grown familiar again. They did not need to speak often about the future. What mattered for tomorrow was written in the ledger, discussed and agreed upon. Their closeness did not come from grand gestures, but from trust proven through work and time. There were tiring days when both fell silent longer than usual. There were disagreements when decisions did not come easily. But beneath it all lay something steady. They were building a life not on who was chosen or rescued, but on who stayed and who carried their share. The life they built did not ask for praise. It showed itself in small details: a fuller meal, a debt crossed out, a quieter classroom, a ranch no longer standing at the edge of collapse. Ruth and Thomas saw those outcomes not as a finish line, but as a structure held upright by choices repeated long enough to become habit. And within that quiet stability, they understood that the most valuable thing was not the town's change of heart, but the fact that neither of them had to change who they were to be seen differently. If this story reminds you of an old decision someone who once mattered, or a season you've already lived through, we invite you to share in the comments. Those stories, short or long, are always worth hearing. If this journey brought you a sense of calm, please like the video to support the channel and subscribe to continue with us through these unhurried stories written for hearts that have weathered many seasons. We look forward to meeting you again in the next story.